two men draw their pistols in the early morning light, facing each other. Shots ring out. One hits a tree branch high in the air, but the other finds its mark. Alexander Hamilton lay dying. The Federalist era will die with him. The first Bank of the United States was the core of the U.S. money system during its 20-year run from 1791 to 1811. While the Constitution forbade the use of paper money, it didn't explicitly prohibit chartering banks, as we discussed last episode. But what do banks do? Banks create paper money. You might think that only the government can create money, but that's not actually true. Let me break it down for you. The way banks work is that they start with a certain level of investment, referred to as the bank's reserves. The bank is then allowed to loan out that much money, and then a lot more, sometimes much more, depending on the banking regulations in effect at that time. In the early 1800s, banks could print up to 3 times the amount in bills as they had in reserve. Yes, banks used to literally print their own paper money. Each one basically had its own currency. These banknotes were a promise to the bearer to pay that amount in gold or silver. You deposited your gold, and these notes let you know that you could get it back whenever you wanted. So if you'd rather have the gold coins again, you were allowed to. But people didn't usually do that, because coins back then were heavy. Paper was much more convenient. Because everyone preferred the notes, banks could usually get away with making more promises represented in those banknotes than they had gold or silver to back it up. And this was perfectly legal. In fact, that was the whole point of banking: money creation. And people thought this money was as good as gold. But the reality was, it's just paper money like any other. Because, spoiler alert, we're about to see that gold was not always available. There wasn't enough gold and silver in the country to rely solely on coins. Some type of paper money was necessary. The Industrial Revolution was starting to ramp up in America, and people needed more and more money in the economy. Businesses needed ways to get loans. Barter and book credit were still both in use, but they weren't going to cut it much longer. And so more and more states started to charter banks. By 1800, the number of banks had almost quintupled. And that made the Bank of the United States absolutely critical, because the smaller state banks weren't always reliable. And with each one printing their own paper currency, at times it was hard to tell which ones were reliable and which ones weren't. But the notes of the US Bank were accepted everywhere with no trouble. So that's the first advantage that the Bank of the United States gave us. People saw an increase in the money supply, and it was reliable. Another advantage was that the federal government kept all its money in the Bank of the US, and they ran all their accounts through it instead of scattering them in a number of smaller banks. That helped tax collection and in paying foreign debts. It was basically a one-stop shop for dealing with the US government. The bank also set up branches in big cities, and that meant there was now infrastructure set up to transfer money safely across the country for the first time ever. The last advantage is about those small state banks that were popping up everywhere. The Bank of the US would keep an eye on them and would save up their notes. If they thought a bank was issuing too many, they would return the notes and ask to be paid in gold. The chance of that happening was feared by every small banker, and that fear kept them in line. So they were a little more conservative in their note issues than they might have otherwise been. That's a good thing for the consumer and for the economy, because no one wants bank failures. But you can probably see how some state banks might resent the hell out of it. The economy in these days was growing by leaps and bounds. After centuries of economic repression, capitalism brought with it a lot of problems, certainly, but also the sense that anyone, at least any white man, could advance in society. That hadn't been the case before. Traders and merchants especially felt that they could get rich and gain respect and social advancement along the way. It was a new feeling, and they loved it. But this meant the Bank of the US would start to get more and more enemies because it stood in the way of a quick profit. Its size did make it an easy target. By the time its charter ran out in 1811, it had more gold and silver in its coffers than all of the other banks in the country at that time combined. It was a huge institution. We're used to the idea of large corporations today, but at that time, there was just no comparison. It was honestly frightening for a lot of people. And then there were the people who hated it all along, like Thomas Jefferson, who was now president, by the way. When his Treasury Secretary, Albert Gallatin, wanted to set up a branch of the US Bank in New Orleans in 1803, Jefferson was really worried about it and wrote to Gallatin,
"An institution like this, penetrating by its branches every part of the Union, acting by command and in phalanx, may, in a critical moment, upset the government."
Gallatin replied,
"Chill out, dude. The little injury they can do to us and the dependence in which they are on government are duly estimated. They are formidable only as individuals and as merchants, and not as bankers. Whenever they shall appear to be really dangerous, they are completely in our power and may be crushed."
Gallatin was a well-respected figure, and with his support for the bank, Jefferson seemed to relax. Gallatin was correct about the amount of power governments have relative to banks. Conspiracy theories about the banking industry's immense, secretive power have been around for hundreds of years, and they're as nonsensical today as they were in Thomas Jefferson's time. Even so, Congress had a spirited debate on whether or not to recharter the US Bank in 1811 with James Madison as president. Madison was one of the biggest opponents of the bank back in 1791, but here he was, asking Congress to recharter it. What changed? Well, he realized it was really useful to the economy. And with Hamilton out of the way, Madison wasn't worried anymore about him as a political rival. Economics, at this point, was more important than politics for Madison. But what about the real constitutional concerns he had about it? Those were starting to fade. The vote to recharter ended up mixed, not at all split along party lines. Some Federalists even voted against it because now the bank was in the hands of their political enemies, the Democratic Republicans. The final tally was razor thin. The bank came up just one vote shy in both the House and the Senate. George Clinton, Madison's vice president, cast the deciding vote against the bank in the Senate. The country was certainly in much better financial shape in 1811 than it had been 20 years ago. So you have to wonder, why did so many congressmen vote no? Some did have constitutional concerns, but others might have been pressured by the smaller state banks who wanted to get out from under the US bank's thumb. And maybe they were right that ending the US bank was in their interests. With no central bank to worry about, banking became more and more profitable, so more and more banks were chartered. By 1815, only 4 years after the decision to end the first bank, the number of state banks had almost doubled. So the state banks were having a great time. On the other hand, Congress realized it had made a mistake pretty quickly, because just 1 year later, a war began. Trouble had been brewing with Britain for a while at this point, but Congress didn't act to start raising money until after it was already too late. The federal government got most of its income back then by taxing imports. But imports took a major nosedive after the war started. The Royal Navy made sure of that. So how are they planning to fund this war? They tried to borrow the money they needed, but that was slow going. So, what do you think they did? You guessed it, they printed money. For this war, they printed $36 million worth of short-term treasury bills. Those are basically IOUs from the treasury, which in reality weren't too different from the Continentals of the Revolution. That meant they were probably unconstitutional. But during a war, no one cared. Congress raised the rest of the money they needed by taxing the states. But all of this was made much more difficult without the Bank of the United States. Its bankers were the experts who had been handling the nation's funds for 20 years at this point. And when we really needed them during a war, they weren't there. The War of 1812 was a disaster for the US. In 1814, the British occupied and burned Washington, D.C. After this devastating attack, banks in Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York were forced to suspend specie convertibility. That means people couldn't cash in their banknotes for gold anymore. When everyone tries to cash in like they do during a panic, the banks run out of money. Imagine today going to a bank and trying to withdraw your money, but being told it wasn't there. That bank would fail, or have to be bailed out by the government, or be bought up by a bigger bank. So this is a huge deal if it happened today, right? But back then, it wasn't a major problem. I guess the bankers had to at least pretend to be sad about it. But they kept doing business. Only now, they could print all the paper money they wanted and didn't need to pay out any gold. It's kind of a perfect situation for them, actually. Although they wouldn't want to admit that. After the war ended, the government had to put pressure on them to resume specie payments. The banks were not in any hurry. We say their notes are backed in gold, quote unquote, but were they really? That was just a promise, and promises can be broken. All money, whether it's backed in gold or not, is only as good as the confidence you have in it. So the banks weren't in any hurry, but Congress, on the other hand, was in a bit of a rush, actually, to recharter the Bank of the United States. We can barely fund this war. We have state banks breaking the rules. Let's get it back like yesterday. James Madison, who was still president, didn't seem to have any more constitutional worries about it.
The validity of such an institution has been repeatedly recognized in acts of the legislative, executive, and judicial branches of the government, accompanied by indications in different modes of a concurrence of the general will of the nation.
He learned through experience the necessity of having an institution like this. In addition to some anti-bank diehards, the only people to oppose the bank now were the Federalists. I think Hamilton must have rolled over in his grave. It's all about politics. They were the opposition party. Anyway, after some debate, it passed easily in the Senate this time, and America had a central bank again. Just like the first bank, it was chartered for 20 years. And also, just like the first bank, one charter was all it would get. The fight that was coming over the second bank of the U.S. would define American politics for generations. Coming onto the national stage just now is the hero of the War of 1812, Andrew Jackson. And he's gonna shake some things up.